has been a couple weeks, but here we are again studying through the book of Acts. And we will be in Acts chapter 25 tonight. And last time, in chapter 24, if you remember, it was a dramatic court scene. You know, for those of us who tend to like those kind of scenarios or TV shows that kind of dramatize that. That was something where when we were reading through chapter 24, if we really get into it, and you can kind of imagine in your mind how this was taking place, where Paul had this chance to defend himself, and where the high priest, the Jewish high priests, were coming, making accusations against him, and Felix was there and presiding over the court. So it was this dramatic scene. Felix, the judge, presiding over the case in Caesarea, and Tertullus, the lawyer, was hired by the Jewish priest to bring charges against Paul. And Paul, who was rescued several times by Lysias, if we remember in the previous chapters, he was the Roman military commander who several times had rescued Paul from almost being ripped to shreds by the Jewish religious leaders there in Jerusalem. And Lysias had also brought Paul to Caesarea in the middle of the night to keep Paul safe from the Jewish priests from killing him, because he had learned of a plot that was going to take place, that they would planned on taking Paul's life. And so Lysias heard about this, and he transported Paul in the middle of the night with hundreds of soldiers to escort him to Caesarea. And so Paul was there. He represented himself against these accusations there in chapter 24. And in that, Tertullus began with the opening remarks against Paul. For the most part, it was weak, it was exaggerated, and some of it was just flat-out lies. And he really didn't come to a dramatic conclusion as to why Paul was to be convicted. If you remember, it was mostly, well, Felix, I'm sure when you check out Paul for yourself, you'll probably see that what I'm saying is true. It was almost as if he didn't believe in the case himself. And he doesn't even have anything to where he says, and then this is what should happen to Paul. He is deserving of this punishment. There was none of that. It was kind of weak. And Paul responds to these accusations. He responds accurately. He responds intelligently. He states the facts, and he also includes the fact that the Jews from Asia who started all of this, as you remember, they followed Paul all the way to Jerusalem, and they started stirring up this whole thing against Paul. And Paul is also making mention of the fact that, guess what? All these Jews from Asia that started this, they're not even here right now. They're not even present here in the courtroom. And it really can't be a good showing, even if your accusers don't show up. So Felix, in his typical fashion, delays on deciding the case. He delays for up to 2 years until finally he was replaced. Now, I guess it is comforting to know that the judicial process in earlier times dragged on as well, like it does sometimes today. So if we think that, oh man, I wish things were like they were in the old days, maybe not. I kind of like the fact that when I go to the dentist, they can put things in my mouth that will deaden the pain, and I don't have to worry about that. So there's those certain moments where I don't really reminisce of maybe about the good old days, where I'm okay with things the way they are now. And if we look and see things back then, really not much has changed from back then till now, other than that we walk around with these devices that shine in our face, and we tend to be able to communicate with everyone at any time of the day. So here we are, 2 years. And in the case of Felix, he would have Paul speak from time to time, hoping that Paul would bribe him. He would bring him in and have Paul speak, almost maybe kind of egging him on. So, is there anything else you'd like to say? You have anything for me? Oh, no, okay, off you go. And Paul, what Paul would bring, instead, Paul scared Felix because of the things that Paul was talking about. So faith in Jesus, righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Very similar to the things that we declare today that people don't want to hear, right? It's sometimes when we talk about those things, there is a judgment to come. There is heaven, and there is hell, and there is saved, and there is unsaved. You're either with me or you're against me. There are the sheep and there are the goats. And the Bible always, it seems like you really can't be in the middle when it concerns the things of the Bible. And I think that's probably why it scares people, because it kind of demands them to respond to it. And I think if you just ignore it, then you can just think in your mind, well, since I didn't see it, then it's not really happening. It'd be in the same way if you were standing on the tracks and a train's coming from the opposite direction and you say, well, I don't see it. It must not be there. While the ground's shaking and people are kind of waving their hands at you and you're looking at them going, he must be crazy. Get off the tracks, come on. That's nuts. But eternity is real, and we will find ourselves in one of two places. And so the Bible always has this distinction. We are either for Christ or we're against him. There always seems to be this dividing power that the Bible has to put people in two different sets of camps here. And so that's something that actually scared Felix, and he didn't want to deal with it. He pushed it off and pushed it off, and so after 2 years, he was finally replaced. And so now we find ourselves in Acts chapter 25. So let's open our Bibles to Acts 25. Okay, let's pray. Jesus, I just pray that these words that we read tonight, God, they'll be used in our life, and you can use them for us and for anything else that you desire, Lord. And we pray that our hearts are open to hear you. We pray that our ears are open to hear you, God. Speak through us. And we thank you that we have these words, that we can look at them anytime we want, Lord. We recognize the fact that there's places around this world that do not have access to your word the way that we do. And help us not to take it for granted, but to embrace it, to study it, to let it soak into our lives. And not just to sit there, Lord, but so it can come back out. And your love and your work can come back out of us, Lord. And do what you desire. And help us to desire to do your will, God. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, Acts chapter 25. Festus, therefore, having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul. And they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem. At the same time, setting an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. After he'd spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. And after he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar you should go. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there was a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him. And I answered them, that is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face, and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. And when the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there and stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so on the next day, when Agrippa had come together with Bernice amid great pomp and had entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you behold this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me, in sending a prisoner, not to indicate also the charges against him. Now, the court scene in this chapter does not appear to be as dramatic as what we saw in chapter 24. It has been 2 years, and Porcius Festus has taken the place of Felix. Paul is still there, and it almost appears to be a rehashing of what happened at court 2 years before this. So Paul had his time at court. He was able to explain to Felix, okay, I see these charges that Tertullus and the high priest are bringing against me. I've responded to those charges. Felix deferred and didn't do anything about it for 2 years. And so now here we have Festus, and we're going back. And so 25 is almost just this repetitive thing that takes place. We see Paul's responses. We see the accusations against the Jews. And so sometimes when you look through these parts of the Bible, the temptation is go, there's really nothing new here. And on we go. What's next in 26? And so we're going to, as we go through it, we're just going to pull out what we see here. But the main things for me is Paul and Festus. And we'll get to that later on as we talk about it this evening. But those are the key figures that just stick out to me. And the contrast between the two. How Paul was, his disposition, and how Festus and his disposition. Now Festus came to Jerusalem, and he was immediately met by the chief priests, accusing and complaining about Paul. They brought charges, but I said complaining because it's been 2 years. Okay, so think about it. They are still stewing over this. This is just something that has not left their mind and has not left their consciousness. I mean, can you imagine being family or friends with these characters? They get off work and it's just Paul this and Paul that, and boy, I just can hardly wait until we can get Paul. Okay, we've heard enough about Paul. We understand you're upset. Can we talk about something else? No, we need to talk about this. And they just seem to be consumed because it's not surprising that as soon as Festus, he's the new governor of the area there, that's the first thing they do. Well, top on my list. I was waiting for you. I've been waiting for you for 2 years because Felix wasn't doing anything about it. So I need to talk to you about Paul. And there they go. They launch into this whole list, this whole litany of charges. That one, they can't prove. That two, Festus haven't heard before, but now he's getting an earful now. So they meet Festus with a request. Bring Paul to Jerusalem. Now, if we know anything about these people, they already had a plan for an ambush for Paul. And this was a couple years prior. And now they're trying to do it again. It doesn't appear that they tell Festus this. It appears that they just said, hey, bring Paul to Jerusalem. We want him to come to Jerusalem. And in doing so, they were setting this up for an attack on Paul to kill him. And so you think about it, that's what they were obsessed with. They were obsessed with killing Paul for 2 years. I just can't picture these people being happy. I could just imagine it. Every time you would see them on the street, you would probably be afraid to even say anything because they were consumed by this. I mean, imagine people like that. The religious leaders, right? They were the leaders of the church. Being consumed by killing Paul says a lot about them and what sin can do when it just is left to stew and fester in your heart the way it did. So they had this plan for an attack on Paul, and Festus says, "Nope. If you want to come to Caesarea to bring charges, then you can do that." And so initially it seems that Festus was on Paul's side, because you see that response, and at that moment he could have just easily said, "Well, sure, yeah, let's do it. That's what you guys want. It's your charges. Let's go to Jerusalem." But that's not what takes place. So it looks like Festus was on Paul's side because of the way he initially reacted to the Jewish leaders. But he shows us who he really is as the chapter goes on. So Festus convened the court, and he brings Paul in. The Jews were there. They were bringing all these charges against Paul, just like we saw before. And so Paul responds and clearly states that he has not broken any law against A, the Jews, B, the temple, or C, against Caesar. He's stating it clearly, I have done no wrong. And wanting to get on the good side of the Jews, I'm sure Festus wanted to start off his new political office on a good note. And maybe if I just get Paul out of here, then I can go back and decorate my office, or I can start finally unpacking, because it just has been nonstop ever since I showed up. When are we going to have the trial on Paul? We got to get Paul. Can we get Paul to Jerusalem? My goodness, let me have a little break here. But Paul responds and says, Festus, I'm already here standing trial. But this is what he says to Paul. Hey, do you want to go to Jerusalem and stand trial? And it would be hard for Paul not to get frustrated at Festus at this point. He's standing there already in court, and Festus says this to him: "Would you like to go to Jerusalem?" And you're thinking, it's almost as if you're in your favorite restaurant, right? And someone comes up to you, "Hey, would you like to go down the street to this little shanty of a diner?" And you think, why would I want to do that? I have the menu out. I already have my drink in my hand. Why would I want to go? I'm already here. And I can imagine Paul thinking, I'm here. You're the judge. Do what you're supposed to do. But Paul responds and he says, I'm already standing trial here right now. By the way, I haven't done anything worthy of death. I'm not afraid of dying if that's what these charges are against me. But I haven't done anything worthy of dying, because none of these charges are true. And then he says the key words that Roman citizens enjoyed. And this was every Roman citizen had the right to say this. And it's very similar. You look at how the Roman government operated, and you can see very much similarities with the Roman government and with our government here in America today. With the rights of the citizens, and the Romans prided on the fact that they could keep the peace in their land, and that every citizen enjoyed these certain rights. And so what Paul said is, I appeal to Caesar. Now Caesar was the head guy of the Roman Empire. He was the emperor. So that's where it would go. If it was getting nowhere within the lower courts, the Roman citizen had the right to say, I will take this up to Caesar. Now I really wonder about this Festus guy. It's almost like he just didn't want to deal with this whole thing. He tried to get Paul to go to Jerusalem. That didn't work. Paul appealed to Caesar, so let's send him that way. So it just seems to be any way that I can get Paul out of my sights, all the better. So a few days after this had taken place, King Agrippa and his wife Bernice show up. And they meet Festus, and Festus explains to them what has been happening with this Paul character. I opened the court, brought Paul in, and there were the Jews. They were accusing him of things I did not expect, centering around this dead Jesus who Paul says is alive. I didn't know how to handle this, and I asked Paul if he wanted to go to Jerusalem for a trial. He said no, and appealed to Caesar, and now he is currently in custody. Kind of a quick summation of what just happened in the previous verses there. But he does bring up an interesting point that does stick out. because he's noting the accusations. He's noting the accusations of the Jews bringing against Paul. They're bringing up these things that I didn't expect. And I'm sure Festus was thinking, okay, Paul's been in prison for 2 years, and he's been on court, and maybe it was just a tough case that Felix just couldn't handle it. So maybe there is something to this, so let's see what it has to say. And then the Jews start opening up, and he's thinking, is that it? That's all you guys have? It has nothing to do with Roman law? It's just some disagreements about your religion? Is that all we're dealing with right now? And it does go on to say that, yeah, disagreements about the religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus, who Paul asserted to be alive. But Paul had always brought Jesus into the picture. Every time that he talked, it was about Jesus. Now, as Festus said, it was Jesus being dead, but he wasn't dead. Paul had seen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Jesus had come to the side of Paul a couple previous chapters ago, and so Jesus was alive. And so the charges that were brought up, they weren't really listed, but it does go into the fact that Jesus is the center of all this. And Paul makes that mention many times in his letters. If there is no Jesus, there is no Christianity. Our faith is dead. And so Paul brings it, and this is being brought up by Festus, so it must have been something to the fact that it's centered around this conversation about Jesus. And that's what we can look back to see when Jesus was crucified. There was such an uproar about him. In the same way now it's being an uproar about Paul, because Paul's not preaching Paul. Paul is preaching Jesus. So that's the difference. If Paul was preaching Paul, it would have been just, okay, you're a nut. Let's just do away with you. But Paul was preaching Jesus. And this is what he was getting because of it. So King Agrippa says, hey, that sounds like some good entertainment. I might like to hear what Paul has to say. How about Friday, 8 o'clock, we go out to dinner, and then we can bring Paul in and see what he has to say. But so the next day, with all this lively introduction, King Agrippa and Bernice enter the auditorium along with the commanders and the big important people of the city. And we've seen this before. If there's any event such as the Olympics or an inauguration or a wedding for that matter, there's always this whole procession going in. There's people lining on either side. You probably hear cheers. There's probably music going on in the background. People are looking at the center of attention, and it's usually the people that are walking in. And so we get this idea when we read this, we can kind of picture that that's what it's like. Somebody important is coming, and just the entrance becomes quite a show in itself. But here they are. They arrive, and they meet Festus. Festus has Paul brought in. And then something quite unusual takes place. I'm reading through this, and I've read through it a couple times, and it just seems kind of interesting that they would have this conversation like this. Because I don't know if I'd want to do this in front of people, admit what was going on. And it's almost as ridiculous, but Paul forced this with Festus when Festus didn't want to make a decision about Paul. Festus basically says to King Agrippa and everybody that's there, I agreed to send Paul to Caesar, but I just don't know what to write about him. So do you think maybe you could ask Paul some questions and maybe write my essay for me and put it in that nice clear plastic binder, and if you could have it on my desk by 7 o'clock in the morning, that would just be wonderful. I mean, just give me something to write, something that I can use, because I have really nothing.